On July 12, 1900, everyone in Middletown, Ohio, headed out to Doty's Grove. The wooded area had once belonged to pioneer founder Daniel Doty, and on this day, it was the site of another historic event. 75 years earlier, almost to the day, Middletown citizens had gathered on Doty's farm to witness the groundbreaking for the Miami and Erie Canal. The canal signaled the beginning of industrial growth for Middletown. But the ceremonies on this hot July day would come to symbolize the beginning of an era of great change for the city. Such change that local citizens in that last summer of the 19th century could hardly have imagined. Their small town would soon become a steel town. The parade that day began at the City Hall on Broad Street, slowly moving east on 3rd Street, across the canal, and turning south on Curtis Street, the dusty road that led to Doty's Grove. The formal ceremonies began with a blessing by Baptist Reverend Rufus W. Weaver, followed by a patriotic welcome from City Solicitor W.S. Harlan. Peace has her victories no less than war, and so we have met to lay the cornerstone of the building of a mighty enterprise that will bring employment and with it prosperity, happiness, and contentment to hundreds of our citizens, and to extend a welcome to the gentlemen of the American Rolling Mill Company, whom we thank for locating this industry here. Next came remarks from the man who would lead the new company, George M. Verity. He praised the local industrial commission for their work. They did everything they could consistently to secure this enterprise for your city. And now that we are to become one of you, the best interest of your city will be our best interests, and we will do all in our power to make Middletown known to all the world as a manufacturing center. The crowd crossed the road to the grounds of the new mill, where W.H. Todhunter presented a history of the industrial evolution of Middletown. This was followed by a history of the American Rolling Mill Company by Major H.P. Lloyd. Next, the list of items to be placed in the cornerstone box was read aloud by W.K. Ronimus, and the cornerstone was laid in place by Mayor Smith. Benjamin Harwitz gave an address, the American flag was raised, the ceremony closed, and the work began. News of the venture had been released in the Middletown Signal on March the 9th, through an announcement in the Cincinnati Enquirer that morning. One of the most gigantic plants in the West is to be put up in Middletown, Ohio immediately. It will be known as the American Rolling Mill Company, and it will be independent of the trusts in every way. Soon, long trenches were being dug, steel beams were raised, and the first building took shape. On July 3rd, the whole town was invited to welcome the new Rolling Mill Company at a celebration on July 12, 1900. By 1900, Middletown, Ohio had grown from a single cabin built by pioneer Daniel Doty in 1796 on the banks of the Great Miami River to an industrial city of 9,000 citizens. The first real industrial growth for the town came with the digging of the Miami and Erie Canal in 1825. The canal opened new markets for local farmers who shipped hogs to Cincinnati. When the railroads came along in 1852, Chicago became the country's pork packing center, and most farmers started growing tobacco. And by 1880, Middletown had become the third largest producer of plug tobacco in the United States. While tobacco was king in Middletown, paper was not far behind. The building of the hydraulic canal in 1852 meant increased water power for new industry. John Irwin and Brothers wasted no time and started construction for the Middletown paper mill along the canal that very same year. By 1880, there were 7 mills producing a variety of paper products. Other local industries manufactured bicycles, buggies, and beer. Middletown had experienced an industrial boom in the last half of the 19th century, with the population growing by 900%. But by 1890, some business leaders were beginning to worry about a new trend in big industry, something called trusts. Larger companies had begun buying up the small-town industries and consolidating them into huge corporations owned by stockholders. In 1898, Continental Tobacco, the Tobacco Trust, bought out the large local tobacco company built by Paul J. Sorg and John Auer. Next, the trust bought the Wilson and Macaulay Company, and tobacco was no longer a locally owned industry. Fearing that plants might close and jobs might be lost, some businessmen sprang into action. An editorial by Middletown Signal editor John Q. Baker proposed a movement to restore Middletown to its former high rank as an industrial city, and that the Antler Club of the Elks Lodge lead the movement. The club met on July 28, 1899, and organized a Middletown Industrial Club, with W.H. Todhunter as chairman, along with E.H. McKnight, T.C. Simpson, and Captain Robert Wilson. In September, the committee recommended that a park commission be appointed to issue bonds for park purposes. The idea was simple. Public money could not be spent to attract industry, but parks could be built and industrial plants could be built in those parks. In October, a $100,000 bond issue was approved by the people, and the Park Commission was given a list of 8 businesses to contact. Eventually, the city took matters into its own hands, setting up an industrial commission with E.H. McKnight, the man with the original idea, as chairman. The stage was now set for George M. Verity and the American Rolling Mill Company to make their entrance. George Matthew Verity entered the world on April the 22nd, 1865, just as the country mourned the death of its leader, President Abraham Lincoln. Earlier that month, the nation's bitter Civil War ended after 4 long years of bloody battles. George M. Verity would begin his life in a new country of United States. Verity's childhood began with tragedy. Barely 2 years old, his mother Mary Ann died, and his father Jonathan grieved terribly. The boy and his older sister Elizabeth moved to the home of grandfather and grandmother Deaton near Springfield, Ohio. Under their loving care, the children remained happy until a new stepmother appeared with ideas of her own. The family was constantly on the move, as Reverend Verity's church assignments in central and southwestern Ohio dictated. As with most youth, George struggled with issues of independence and identity throughout his growing years. But he had become a popular member of his senior class of 13 students by the time he delivered his salutatory address at his graduation. That year, 1883, the family moved again to the 7th largest city in the country, the Queen City, Cincinnati. Though his father had hoped his son would follow him into the pulpit, George had other plans, business plans. In just a few short months, young Verity found himself managing a grocery store and oyster bar on Pearl Street when he was just 19. He had also met his future wife, young Jean Standish. The small store thrived for another 3 years until the larger Kroger stores took most of the business away. But in 1887, George met the Major, Major H.P. Lloyd. Lloyd was an influential Cincinnati lawyer, a friend of the Taft family, and the new owner of the sheet metal business, a business about which he knew nothing. The good major needed a good manager, and George M. Verity needed a good job. Verity got the job, and as fate would prove, a lot more. The L.L. Sagendorf Iron, Roofing, and Corrugating Company was located between Sycamore and Maine. There it converted iron and steel sheets into building materials, such as sheathing, roofing, and siding. Lloyd and his associate, Louis L. Sagendorf, had acquired the company when it went into receivership. Under young Verity's management, the company was able to pay off all debts in just 2 years. He was a success and a new husband. In 1889, the company reorganized as the American Steel Roofing Company, with G.M. Verity as vice president and general manager. The preacher's son was a steel man and a new father. The last quarter of the 19th century was turbulent. It was a time of great invention, foreign intervention, westward exploitation, and industrial competition. During that short period, the country witnessed the development of the telephone, the phonograph, the bicycle, the electric light, the kinetoscope, the soft drink, the chocolate bar, and the automobile. America was entering a new age of communication and convenience. Americans were mobile. They had wheels to take them just about anywhere. After its invention in 1873, the bicycle slowly increased in popularity. By 1895, everyone wanted one. In Middletown that year, the Miami Cycle and Manufacturing Company was organized by industrialist Paul J. Sword, and in short order was producing the Miami bicycle, the Hudson, and the popular race cycle. The company was on its way to becoming the largest bicycle manufacturer in the country. In 1897, Middletown welcomed a new form of mass transit, the electric trolley traction line. The interurban was a single-track street railroad operated by electricity. In Middletown, the line ran down the center of Main Street and it provided a cheap transportation through the Miami Valley. The grandfather of transportation, however, was the railroad. By the time George M. Verity was born, there were already more than 35,000 miles of iron road in America. But already, iron was being replaced as the age of steel was born. New processes for providing the harder substance were being developed, and a Scotsman named Andrew Carnegie understood its future. Carnegie's investment in the railroad industry started in 1856. A few years later, he organized the Keystone Bridge Company and hired steelmaker Captain William Richard Jones to make steel bridges. In 1874, Carnegie brought the Bessemer process of steelmaking to America from Europe. Andrew Carnegie's plant at Homestead, Pennsylvania soon became the largest in the world. Year by year, Carnegie's control of the American steel industry increased. But he did have competition in the form of banker John Pierpont Morgan. In 1898, Morgan formed the Federal Steel Company, made up of several smaller steel mills and factories, and the stage was set for a battle to control the nation's largest trust, the Steel Trust. While these events played out on the national scene, back in Cincinnati, Ohio, George M. Verity was very busy with plans of his own. After a failed attempt to reduce cost for all by consolidating about 25 sheet metal companies into 4 plants, Verity decided that the American Steel Roofing Company needed a mill of its own to roll sheets. But he had no plans, no partners, and no assets. He did, however, have offers from 2 Ohio cities, Zanesville and Middletown, each offering land and $75,000. Verity turned next to an old friend who knew the steel business, William Thomas Simpson. Simpson's Cincinnati Rolling Mill and Tin Plate Company had been recently bought out by the Tin Plate Trust in January 1899. But he liked Verity's idea, and Simpson, along with Major Lloyd, helped him get the necessary pledges of subscriptions for $350,000 of common stock. During a visit to Pittsburgh to learn how steel was made, Verity forged a bold new plan. To ensure his independence from the Steel Trust, his company would make its own steel bars to be rolled into sheets. To do this, he would employ the new open hearth process now being introduced into the country. Now, Verity visited Zanesville and Middletown and decided that Middletown's location on the Miami-Erie Canal and Great Miami River was more suited to his needs. So on December 2, 1899, the American Rolling Mill Company was organized, and on December the 27th, the company was incorporated with capital stock of $200,000, later increased to $500,000. On the 29th, local citizens met at the Antlers Club to consider Verity's proposal. They wanted some time to make a decision, but later that night, at City Solicitor Ben Harwitz's house, the real deal was struck between Harwitz, Verity, and his attorney. It was December 30th, 1899. George M. Verity was ready to put his plan into action. 1 year later, J.P. Morgan made an offer to Andrew Carnegie to buy his steel company for $480 million. Carnegie accepted immediately and became the richest man in America. 2 months later, on February 26, 1901, the contract was signed and J.P. Morgan formed the United States Steel Corporation. America's largest and smallest steel companies were in business. By the summer ceremonies at Doty's Grove, construction of the central works of the new American Rolling Mill Company had begun. So had the search for men. The word spread quickly that a new mill was being built in Middletown, Ohio, and those who were adventuresome or unsettled about the mergers of the large trusts came to investigate. They were intrigued by the idea of this new company, the first fully integrated plant to convert pig iron and scrap into manufactured building materials, ready for the consumer's use in one continuous plant and on one plot of ground. Leading the construction of the open hearth furnace was Robert B. Carnahan, Jr., a man who had recently worked for Andrew Carnegie at the huge Homestead Works. Philadelphian James Strawbridge would be the general superintendent, and Tom Rogers would lead the sheet metal rollers. These three formed George M. Verity's first Board of Strategy. On September 10, 1900, the first shovelful of dirt was dug to begin the #1 open hearth furnace. Work progressed quickly. By the end of the year, the furnace was built and 200 men had been hired. They were ready to make steel. On January 1, 1901, the Middletown Daily Signal printed a special supplement to usher in the new century. The dawn of the 20th century breaks upon us, and fair Middletown, the pride of the great Miami Valley, hails the new epoch with feelings of mingled pride and anxiety. There was no shortage of anxiety as the time came to make the first heat of steel. On the morning of February 7, 1901, after 50,500 pounds of pig iron and scrap with 7% limestone were melted down into a steel heat in 12 hours, 50 minutes, the first heat was ready to be tapped. Robert Carnahan gave the order, Floyd Barlow knocked the stopper out of the tap hole, and Orley Moles caught the liquid metal in the ladle. From that first heat, sheets were rolled, galvanized, and turned into finished products. The experiment was a success, and now the real work began. The next few months were spent working out problems of broken equipment, burned furnace roofs, and gas house fumes. The work was punishing and dangerous. Safety was not an issue yet. But eventually the bugs were worked out, and most heats yielded 80 to 100 ingots, weighing 800 to 1,000 pounds. By the end of the year, there was talk of a second furnace. The first year of the 20th century proved to be as tumultuous in the political arena as it was in the steel industry. 1900 had been a presidential campaign year, with the incumbent William McKinley, the Republican from Canton, Ohio, running against the equally popular Democrat William Jennings Bryan. Early in the campaign, McKinley seemed to be in trouble as he was identified with the ever-increasing growth of the trusts. But then, McKinley decided to keep a low profile and send his spirited vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, to take on Bryan. Roosevelt was a former governor of New York State and a hero of the Rough Riders campaign in the short but significant Spanish-American War. The war was fought over control of the Philippine Islands in 1898, and the U.S. victory signaled the beginning of the country's foreign expansion. The issue quickly became a major one for the presidential candidates, but the public was more interested in reform for big industry, and Roosevelt was urging tighter control of the trusts. The Republicans won, and the century turned. On March the 3rd, 1901, the incorporation of the first $1 billion corporation, U.S. Steel, was announced. And the following day, McKinley and Roosevelt were sworn into office. A few short months later, the country was shaken by the assassination of President McKinley at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. On September 14th, Theodore Roosevelt was sworn into office. At 42 years of age, he was the youngest president in American history. In his first message to Congress in December, Roosevelt called for federal supervision of interstate trusts, an 8-hour workday, an aid that helps a man to help himself. At the Central Works on Curtis Street, work was guided by a spirit of invention and innovation which was leading to expansion. In the first 5 years of operation, the company went from one 75-ton furnace to two 50-ton furnaces, from 200 to 700 men, and from $281,000 to more than $1 million in sales. The American Rolling Mill Company was making profits and new products. Since 1880, iron and steel had been used in large electric dynamos and motors, but the machines had limitations. Thin laminated iron and steel sheets was the answer, but no mill was producing electrical sheets with a uniform thickness. The American Rolling Mill Company accepted the challenge from Westinghouse, a large manufacturer of electrical machines, and after some experimentation with the level of sulfur, phosphorus, and manganese, the first heat of electrical steel was made in May 1903. A month later, the first carload of electrical sheets was shipped, and Armco was in the specialty steel business. And it was about to enter one of the biggest markets. It had taken several years for the automobile to catch on in America since the Duryea brothers built their first gasoline-powered vehicle in 1892. The horseless carriage was expensive and unreliable, but in 1903, Henry Ford built his Model A, the family horse, he called it. He had an idea that he could build more cars, better, and cheaper. By 1908, that idea led to the Model T, the first mass-produced car in America. Manufacturers were now looking for steel for their auto bodies. steel that could be formed and painted. Once again, Armco answered the call. Their first customer was the Racine Manufacturing Company. In 1910, Armco's cold-rolled sheet, later known as Armco Gray Smooth, proved to be adequate. But as automobile production increased, Armco developed new cold-rolled methods and soon had orders for fender stock from the Chalmers Motor Car Company and the Cadillac Company. By 1913, this new grade called silver finish was used in over half the auto bodies built by Ford. The early pioneer spirit of Armco also led to the development of their most significant product, Armco ingot iron. In reaction to a U.S. government report critical of the rusting qualities of steel, Armco was determined to produce an open hearth metal of the highest commercial quality. Experimental heats led to a rust-resisting material called ingot iron, advertised and sold as 99.94% pure iron. Challenged by the competition, Armco set up a metallurgical research and chemical laboratory in 1910 devoted exclusively to problems in the production of Armco's ingot iron. The lab was the first of its kind in the steel industry, and at its head was Wesley Beck, who had come to Armco from Westinghouse Corporation. In 1915, at the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, Armco ingot iron was awarded a grand prize by an international jury. The product became widely popular and was used in the manufacturing of hundreds of products, including stoves, flumes, kitchen and wire products, and culverts. The American Rolling Mill Company was at full capacity and needed to grow. Although Zanesville, Ohio was not chosen by George M. Verity for the site of his first plant, the city did get a new rolling mill, the Curtis Sheet Steel and Corrugating Company. On October 15, 1901, the first bar was rolled and the first sheet the next day. Soon a relationship was formed with the American Rolling Mill Company to provide steel bars, and in June 1905, the Zanesville plant merged with Armco. By 1910, the mills at Middletown and Zanesville were producing over 4,500 tons of sheets per month, with 1,500 employees. But the demand for more tonnage was growing. The Central Works operated as a small mill, producing ingots only 8 inches by 8 inches by 4 feet long. Now it was time to think big. In March 1910, ground was broken on a site east of town for a new modern plant soon called East Side Works. Everything was big. 4 70-ton open hearth furnaces would now produce ingots 6 feet long and 24 by 30 inches at the base. A year and a half later, operations began, and Armco was a big mill company. When the price of pig iron increased dramatically, Armco looked for a blast furnace. The Columbus Iron and Steel Company had supplied most of Armco's pig iron for years, and when an acquisition agreement was reached in 1917, Armco had its blast furnaces and a sinter plant, a coke plant, 3 West Virginia coal mines, 21 iron ore mines, 19 lake ore vessels, and 9,500 acres of timberland. Along with its expanded production, the company had to make sure orders would increase. The first district office was opened in Chicago on New Year's Day, 1911, and soon there were offices in 12 major cities. International sales began in South America in 1912, and quickly, Armco ingot iron was being marketed around the world. At home on June the 11th, 1917, executives laid the cornerstone for a new general office. Early the following year, the building was finished, company had a new home right across the street from the first office. The little plant on Curtis Street was an international corporation with annual sales of more than $13 million and 4,500 employees. When Armco began operations in 1901, George M. Verity had stated, "I'll pin my faith to men." The men hadn't let him down. They came to Middletown with certain steel-making skills, skills with names that fit the work: melters, pitmen, gas makers, skull crackers, roughers, rollers, catchers, and doublers. Their numbers grew quickly. The early days of Armco were difficult. The small company with the big idea was challenged every day with equipment failure, lack of money, and back-breaking, dangerous work. Most work was still done by hand in the unbearable heat of molten steel mixed with gaseous fumes. The workday was 12 hours long, and mill bosses demanded a full day's work. But the men stayed. Something was different about this company. That something was George M. Verity. Verity's success in business had been based on the simple principles of loyalty and fair play. He surrounded himself with managers who believed as he did. Business partner W.T. Simpson, boyhood pal R.C. Phillips, mill superintendent Robert Carnahan, and a young man who was inspired by Verity's vision and his approach to management. Charles R. Hook would become as important to the success of Armco as George M. Verity. Hook was hired as night superintendent in 1902 and quickly established himself as a good listener and a quick learner. He believed, as Verity did, that management and labor be considered co-workers, working together in a spirit of cooperation and mutual interest. Hook put his radical idea to work by creating advisory committees for each work term. The members were picked by the men themselves, and they were responsible for handling problems of work stoppage and discipline. Issues of safety were now addressed by safety committees, with 3 members rotating every 2 months. This activity eventually grew into a Department of Safety and Labor. Safety first was now a top priority, and the lost time accident rate decreased dramatically. Armco workers were also looking out for themselves off the job. In 1903, a meeting was held in Redmond's Hall on Broad Street to discuss creating an organization to help members who might be off work due to sickness or accident. The American Rolling Mill Mutual Benefit Association of Middletown, Ohio, began with $100. The entrance fee was $1, with monthly dues of 50 cents. $5 a week was paid for sickness and $50 in case of death. In just 2 years, the association had enrolled 75% of the men in the plant, and the amount paid for sickness or injury gradually increased. Employees now decided to organize a social and athletic club, and by February 1913, the group was organized and had a headquarters on the 4th floor of the Sword Building. The club's first activity was a minstrel show, a popular form of entertainment at the time. Sports activities began when the club organized a baseball league with 6 teams playing on Saturday afternoons at the Middletown ballpark. That year, it was decided that the Mutual Interest Association and the Social and Athletic Club should merge, and the Armco Association was formed. The activities of the organization grew quickly to include track and field meets, tennis tournaments, billiard and pool contests, and a dance program. The company contributed to the atmosphere of mutual interests in several ways. George M. Verity felt that the company's responsibilities to employees did not just begin and end with their time on the jobs. In the early days, a medical dispensary was set up at Central Works, and when East Side Works was constructed, it included a main hospital with facilities for handling medical emergencies and regular treatment. For off-the-job conditions, Armco maintained a corps of workers to help employees make their home life better. It prepared and provided plots of land for employees and awarded prizes for the best gardens. Nurses were provided to visit employees' homes to care for the sick. The Armco Colored Club was organized to address the needs of the company's African American population. Although the relations were generally good between local white and black citizens, in the early days of the 20th century, it was understood that everyone knew their place in the social structure of the community. Issues of discrimination and segregation were often ignored or not recognized. The Colored Club consisted of 6 dorms, a restaurant, bathhouse, and a recreation hall. Armco also maintained a bachelor's club for single men and provided rental housing for those new to town. Since the Statue of Liberty had been dedicated in 1886, the poet Emma Lazarus gave Liberty her timeless message. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The huddled masses had flooded to America in ever-increasing numbers. From 1890 to 1900, the U.S. population increased by 13 million. Most immigrants were unskilled and uneducated, but many European steel workers made the voyage to find work with better wages and better working conditions. Those who found their way to Middletown were housed in special bunkhouses and cottages. The old Doty homestead on the canal was converted into the Foreign Club, a social center where men could relax, read newspapers from their home country, and take lessons in American citizenship. Soon, many of these workers brought their families to America, and new company houses were built with yards, gardens, and playgrounds. The lives of steel workers at American Rolling Mill Company were now much improved. Next, the company turned its attention to Middletown.